But thank you all for being here today. We are going to be talking about Virginia's first wildlife corridor action plan, some opportunities for terrestrial and aquatic passage. We will be joined by Amy Golden from the Virginia Department of Transportation, and I'm very excited to have her speak with you all. But before we dive into that, and to give Amy a little bit of time to join us again, I'll give a little bit of background in case any of you are new and don't know who we are. We are Wild Virginia. We're a grassroots member-based nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting and connecting Virginia's wild places. We are a statewide organization. We have headquarters in Charlottesville, but we work all across the state. We do this work to protect and connect Virginia's wild places through a few campaigns that you'll see here. I've listed our Virginia's Water Future. I know that we're joined today by Dave Slide in the audience, who runs that, and Fighting the Mountain Valley Pipeline, my program, which is the Habitat Connectivity Program. And we also run an Outings and Education program. Our Outings and Education program is really aimed at making sure that everyone can appreciate and work to protect the land they love, and that can be in the form of webinars like you all are here today to join us, or we also hold monthly book clubs. So I did want to make a little plug that our next book club is next Monday, May 22nd at 7 p.m. on Zoom. You can join in our Eventbrite link, and we'll send out a follow-up email with links to that afterwards. But our book next week will be Sounds Wild and Broken, and it explores the mysteries of how sound has evolved and the importance of sound to the beings we all share our planet with. So we would love for you all to join us. You are welcome to participate in these Zoom calls, even if you haven't read the book. So feel free to join if that interests you. Answered, you can upvote it, and we'll make sure to try to hit it at the end. All right, so let's get started. So let's lay the groundwork with a couple of definitions related to habitat connectivity. First of all, what is habitat connectivity itself? So habitat connectivity is the degree to which the landscape facilitates or impedes movement of organisms and other ecological processes. That's a lot of words, but basically it's just how easy is it for animals or different processes such as pollination to cross boundaries. Then we're also going to set the groundwork and say what a wildlife corridor is. So a wildlife corridor is intact habitat that allows movement between other habitat. So that is just the connection between, for example, swaths of forest, or maybe two different farmlands, like the connection between there. That's a wildlife corridor. Wildlife vehicle conflicts is a term you'll see used throughout this presentation, and it will be defined as any reported adverse incident that involves a moving vehicle and a wild animal, and the animals reported being the cause of the accident. So this is a term that was defined in the Wildlife Corridor Action Plan, and this is how it was defined, so that's how we're going to be using it throughout this presentation. We'll also talk about wildlife crash countermeasures, and those are measures that we take to reduce or eliminate a conflict between wildlife and the vehicles. And then, of course, wildlife crossings, which I'm sure many of you are excited to hear about and learn about. But these are underpasses or overpasses that allow wildlife to pass unharmed beneath or above a road to access their habitat. So what I really want to hit on the differences between a wildlife corridor and a wildlife crossing, because those words are used interchangeably a lot, but they don't exactly mean the same thing. So wildlife crossings are one way to protect wildlife corridors, or to establish a wildlife corridor, for instance. So this is a little visual representation of this. You can see on the left, we have no connectivity, but really it's obstructed connectivity, because the animals are going to try and pass through there. There's just obviously dangers there in the middle, the obstruction, and that's why we're here in the first place, trying to eliminate those dangers. So we like to say that's obstructed connectivity. If you connect it with a corridor, you can see there's habitat connecting two different habitats. And then with a crossing, obviously there's a connection connecting those habitats over the obstruction. So why do we care about these wildlife vehicle conflicts? Well, aside from hurting it, like wildlife, killing wildlife, it's very expensive, and wildlife vehicle conflicts cost Americans over $8 billion every year, according to the Federal Highway Administration. That's quite a bit of money. And if you zoom in more on Virginia, we are the 13th highest risk state in the nation for wildlife vehicle conflicts. You have a 1 in 72% chance of hitting an animal, or 1 in 72 chance of hitting an animal with your vehicle here in this state. And to just kind of even highlight it even more, our next door neighbor, our neighboring state, West Virginia, ranks consistently as #1 highest risk. So there's a lot of wildlife moving around in this area and a lot of people driving around. So there's a lot of conflicts. So what's being done to kind of address these issues? So if we zoom out again back to the whole United States, there's many states that are starting to either enact legislation, introduce legislation, or introduce executive orders to address these wildlife vehicle conflict issues. In 2020, Virginia was one of the very first states in the whole country to enact legislation specifically to protect habitat connectivity and wildlife corridors. So that's a really great step that we made there. We were definitely one of the first on the East Coast, but we were one of the first in the country, so it's pretty cool. In 2021, the federal bipartisan infrastructure law went into effect, and that really caused a wave of legislation in 2022 where more states followed up and introduced legislation to protect habitat connectivity and wildlife corridors, because there was a lot of financial incentives presented in that law. So it's very exciting. We're going to hear a little bit about that near the end of the presentation. So we're very excited about that, but let's kind of zoom in and see what examples of these wildlife crash countermeasures are that are being implemented. So you've probably seen these deer crossing signs. They are put in areas where deer are known to travel very heavily across roads, and they kind of just make you aware. But a lot of us become kind of blind to them because they stay up all year. So these changeable message signs are meant to bring extra attention during high times of traffic. So deer mating season, for instance, they'll put these changeable message signs up to make you alert that there are deer in the roadways moving around. Aside from just driver awareness, we can also use infrastructure to countermeasure these conflicts. And you've probably all seen pictures of these beautiful wildlife bridges out. This one's in Banff National Park in Canada, built for elk, but all kinds of wildlife use them. They reduce crashes, wildlife move over, they're vegetated with a lot of native wildlife, or not a lot of native vegetation. Very beautiful, but also very expensive. So those are a lot, you see them out west and in Europe. Out east, we have a lot of different opportunities for a lot cheaper and probably like a low-hanging fruit kind of to get this going. And that's what you see on the right. And these are underpasses. So these can be already existing box culverts, for instance, that were not even built for wildlife. But if you add directional fencing, these wildlife will be funneled into them. And it's pretty cool to see that happen. Another reason this is really effective out east, or potentially, is we don't have giant herds of migrating mammals yet, like they do out west. So these kinds of culverts are really easy to, not easy, I won't say, but they're a good opportunity to clear out debris, add some lights, add some fencing, and get some real results in there. Okay, so now that we have that background of some examples and things, I'm going to pass it over to our guest, Amy, and she is going to start diving into what this Wildlife Corridor Action Plan says and what we can do with it. So, Amy, you just let me know when you want me to advance, and I'll try to pick up too.
Okay, thank you for the invite and having me here tonight. And again, apologies for the technical difficulties at the beginning, but you gave an introduction to myself, right, Courtney? Okay, so we're good to go.
I did. All right. Maybe give a little bit more. I didn't say what you do, so go ahead and tell them what you do.
Okay, so I'm VDOT's land stewardship manager. So that's a brand new position in our Office of Transportation Sustainability. So the sustainability office is brand new. We had our 1-year anniversary, so I still consider us pretty new. But I'm one of 3 positions, and we're pretty unique positions, but we're all really closely related. So one is resilience planning for infrastructure, resiliency planning. And the other is decarbonization, so reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and decarbonization of roadways. And then the third is land stewardship. So we all work pretty closely together. And I've been in this position for a couple months and with VDOT for about 5 years now. So land stewardship covers all things from wildlife corridors and connectivity to aquatic organism passage and fish passage projects and pollinator habitat, and then just kind of general right-of-way management and compatible land uses and maximizing benefits in the right-of-way. So that's my position in a nutshell. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. All right, so I'll just give a brief introduction or background to the legislation that required the Wildlife Corridor Action Plan. So in 2020, Senate Bill 1004 passed, and that basically made the Department of Wildlife Resources the lead agency in delivering the plan and provided input from VDOT, DCR, and the Department of Forestry. But the legislation really just had 5 basic requirements. So we had the plan has to identify wildlife corridors of high quality habitats and identify barriers to wildlife movement along those wildlife corridors, and then identify areas of high risk of wildlife vehicle collisions. And then from that mapping and analysis, we were to identify priority projects to mitigate those effects, and then develop a public mapping tool for planning purposes. So next slide, please. So what's the status of the plan? It's pretty exciting news to announce that it's final and it's available publicly. So it's been released. It's available on DWR's website for everyone to go check out if you haven't already. And then you can go to DCR's Natural Heritage Data Explorer and view the mapping layers from the WCAP. So a big deal for Virginia. I think just having this plan in general is a really big step for the state. So it's exciting news. All right, so a little bit of the plan framework next. So we struggled for a while about how to even organize the corridor action plan. So we ended up using the bill itself. So the legislative requirements and the legislative intent to kind of frame the plan and organize it and how to cover a lot of important information. So we ended up going with this 3-theme approach and realizing that there could be a lot of different people picking up the plan and using it for different reasons. Starting on the left, so somebody could pick up the plan and want to focus on just promoting driver safety or making roadways safer for wildlife and the traveling public, so they could hone in on the wildlife vehicle conflict sections and the hotspot analysis and mapping that we did in the WCAP. And then just kind of focus on areas with higher risks of wildlife vehicle conflicts. But so if somebody is looking at it from a habitat connectivity standpoint or a conservation standpoint, say, for example, nonprofits or city or county local planners are picking up the plan from a conservation standpoint, they could look at the wildlife biodiversity resilience layers and look at the conservation actions as their focus. And then if the third on the right is if you don't want to pick either of those, you want to pick both. We did do a nexus analysis. So basically a GIS intersection exercise where we overlaid those two, the hotspot analysis and the wildlife corridors, and identified 26 coarsely scaled areas to kind of advance benefits for both reasons. So there's a couple different ways you could pick up the plan and use the data. So next slide. All right, so the next couple slides, I'll go through the 3 themes kind of left from right there that we just had on the previous slide. So the first is improving driver safety. So the planning team realized pretty early on that we had a heavy lift in front of us. So we did decide to divide and conquer. So VDOT took the lead on the wildlife vehicle conflict analysis. So we ended up contracting with Virginia Tech Transportation Institute to do a hotspot analysis. So heading into it, we really kind of had three main goals that we were trying to achieve. We wanted to be able to visualize animal-related crashes along Virginia roadways and certain road classes. So we knew we had a certain amount of carcass removal data and a lot of police report crash data. So compiling the different data sets was a heavy lift at the beginning, but we ended up, our primary data set was an 8-year Virginia State Police crash data set for years, I think 2013 to 2020. So from that, we wanted to produce a geo-reference layer that we could visualize the hotspots and then include that and bring it into the bigger WCAP analysis. So then we also wanted to be able to filter by the type of animal that was causing the crash. So deer, interestingly enough, is the only species that's really specifically called out as causing an accident in police reports. So we ended up obtaining a separate 10-year data set for black bear collisions from the DMV. So they provided that directly to Tech and VDOT. So we were able to bring that into the analysis and then tease out the other animal related crashes. So there is a small percentage in the police report data that's livestock and pets, domestic pets. But it's typically 3/4 or more deer collisions. So it is very heavily deer that's reported to police that was brought into the analysis. So very little was skewed by the other animal related crashes. And then to make sure our methods were repeatable and transparent. So we did this as a statewide analysis, and we wanted other folks that were using it at more of a regional scale or a route level or a county level scale to take the same methods and basically repeat it. So that was a pretty big goal of ours. Let's see the next slide. All right, so just real quick, I know Courtney went over this, but I did want to go over what a wildlife vehicle conflict is because we use it quite a bit and the plan uses it quite a bit. So what it really is, it's basically an adverse incident with an animal and a vehicle, but there's not always necessarily a collision with an animal or an object. So it's basically an animal caused the accident and the reason that it was reported to the police, but there might not always be a crash or a carcass. So it does really bring in the driver response piece. So a lot of times drivers will swerve to avoid an animal, but not necessarily hit the animal, or it wasn't reported in the police report data. So it just brings in a lot of bias that you need to be aware of, I think, when you look at this data. And you're kind of putting a lot of faith in the people that report the information to the state police. So there isn't always a crash. Sorry, there isn't always a crash or collision. Like a lot of times you'll hear similar terms like animal vehicle collision or crash or deer vehicle crash that I think there's a physical contact or an accident, but with conflict, it's kind of a bigger, more encompassing term. So next slide. All right, so this is just a real brief summary of the hotspot analysis that we did. So Tech, the first step was just QA/QCing that data set that we got from state police. So that was a heavy lift. We wanted to make sure we had really good data before we headed into the mapping. And then from that, we created a point density map. So I think we ended up with about 61,000 points across the state. And from that, we determined the functional road class that we wanted to look at in Virginia, and then created those point densities to the road, brought it to the road segment. So created 1 mile road segments, and then the crash percentage category that we wanted to look at. So for the road classes, I just wanted to summarize real quickly. We decided to go with VDOT's crash analysis tool and our functional road class system. So this is typically what traffic engineers look at for safety perspective and safety projects. So we wanted to be pretty consistent with that as much as possible. So I think we picked, we looked at interstates, freeways, other expressways and freeways, and then arterials, and then major collector road. So on the right-hand side is the final wildlife vehicle conflict map. So this represents all conflicts across the state. And then we also did similar heat maps. We did individual heat maps for deer only, bear only, and then other animal-related conflicts. Next slide. All right, and here's just a couple key results. So the worst hotspots are the dark blue and the purple colors. So those are the highest rates, the highest conflict rates. So to get the worst category, the 1 mile segments that fell in the worst category had to have a minimum conflict rate of 3.25 conflicts per mile per year. So we'll just go through the parts of the state that we saw some of the worst areas. In the north, we had Fauquier County and Culpeper and Rappahannock. And Loudoun County had some pretty high deer collision rates for the north side. And then on the southwestern side of the state, we had Bedford, Albemarle, and Montgomery County near Roanoke and Blacksburg had some pretty high rates in Charlottesville. So, yeah. Next slide. All right, well, I wanted to talk a little bit about the wildlife corridor analysis that we did. So I won't spend a whole lot of time on this. I was really more involved with the wildlife vehicle conflict, and so I'll give a brief overview, but I'm not the best person to talk about the wildlife corridor modeling that we did in the plan. But I definitely recommend that people go to chapter 3 in the plan, because there's a whole lot of information about the wildlife biodiversity corridors. So what the team decided to do was use the resilience corridors and Conserve Virginia as our basis. And there was a couple reasons for that. The resilience corridors are based in the natural landscape assessment. So this is a statewide network of natural lands that connect relatively open, contiguous natural areas, and they contain natural landscape blocks. So there's areas of a minimum of 100 acres that support natural cover. So it's a pretty connected, relatively intact network of lands. So we felt from a landscape corridor connectivity standpoint that really represented the habitats and the wildlife species that we're representing in the WCAP. So that was the basis for using the resilience corridors in the WCAP. We felt it was really pretty consistent with the conservation habitat values that we were looking for high habitat quality. So that's all I'll cover on the corridor figure. So moving on to the right side of that figure that I showed earlier, the opportunities to advance mutual benefits. So this is personally one of my favorite figures in the WCAP, and it's just kind of neat because it brings together the most important layers of the results from the mapping that came out of the plan, essentially. So we did an intersection analysis. We got the wildlife corridors, and then the top 2 highest categories for conflicts were brought in as the areas of highest wildlife vehicle conflicts. So we identified 26 nexus areas, we're calling them, that are really largely scaled. They're 25 square miles or larger. So they're coarsely scaled, but they do kind of represent opportunities to improve driver safety and wildlife corridor connectivity kind of in the same location. So if that's the purpose where you're trying to advance both of those purposes, you could definitely check out the nexus analysis in the WCAP. And then, but also realizing that there's a lot more work to be done. I think because it is such a broadly scaled area or analysis that we did, that there's more work to be done, and the plan acknowledges that, but I just wanted to get that out there. Next slide. All right, so what's next for the corridor action plan? So we did want to be really, I think one of our goals in the first attempt of the plan was to be real honest about the sections of the legislation that we were able to meet and not able to meet. So we weren't real clear about the recommended actions and the future actions coming out of the plan, that the plan would be iterative, and this was the first attempt at this plan and getting the information out to the public. But we did identify 14 recommended actions in the plan that I'll just summarize here real quickly. We do want to spend more time and effort in refining the wildlife corridors. So really honing in on at-risk species and other species of interest that the resource agencies want to focus wildlife habitat corridor modeling on. So that's going to be a big effort for the next plan iteration. Assessing aquatic barriers and aquatic barrier connectivity is a big part of what we weren't able to achieve this time. But I'll talk about road stream crossings a little bit more in the next couple slides. But we do think that corridor aquatic connectivity and aquatic passage and road stream crossings is a huge opportunity to improve terrestrial and aquatic passage. So that's going to be a big undertaking, I think, for the next iteration of the plan, is just that aquatic connectivity analysis. And developing predictive models for the conflict analysis, the vehicle collision part. We do want to take another closer dive and a closer look at the risk question and really find out why those counties that I listed off before are seeing higher rates. So yeah, kind of looking at the traffic patterns, the traffic volume, and then some landscape features that kind of influence why we're seeing so many more crashes in those parts of the state. And then develop cost benefit analysis. I think this is a big one for a lot of the agencies involved, is just valuing of wildlife crossings. So we can make informed transportation decisions about how we're focusing our dollars towards efforts, and just getting a good understanding of the return on investment, and where, really having that data to support where we're investing in wildlife enhancements in one location versus another is really important. So developing the cost benefit analysis will help identify our priority lists for wildlife crossings in next time. And then developing a framework for regional partnerships. I think I alluded to this a little bit before, but kind of developing more of a framework for regional teams to come together. I think a lot of this, to have this plan be successful, it's going to be a lot of like pulling together the key stakeholders and nonprofits and land trusts and agencies, and just the more local folks that really know their area and the conservation needs. So I think, taking this statewide plan and just really giving some more guidance to implement it at a more regional level is something that we'll try to tackle next time. And then developing a GIS planning tool is on the list for future iterations. Next slide. So just a couple more slides here. So I really think of the Wildlife Corridor Action Plan as kind of the statewide framework that kind of sets the stage for more work in the future. Again, pulling together the key stakeholders and bringing the right people to the table to kind of get these projects off the ground is important. And I just feel like the WCAP just kind of gives that platform for those conversations to start, and for people to basically focus on the key wildlife corridors, the deer collision hotspots and things like that. So it really just kind of lays the groundwork for more work to occur, for recovery efforts. And so here's just a couple examples. I know Courtney went through some really great photos of wildlife enhancements, but road stream crossings, I talked about those a little bit before, but with bridges and culvert projects, there's a lot that you can do that are just design features that if it's captured early enough in a project, a road project or a culvert replacement or a bridge replacement, that if you scope it in early enough and get the costs in there, that you can do a lot for just aquatic and terrestrial connectivity and just habitat improvements for a lot of different species. So really creating that kind of underbridge habitat provides a lot of value to a lot of different species. And then creating habitat through the culvert and just all that micro habitat area for small reptiles and amphibians. I mean, there's just a lot of aquatic and subaquatic, semi-aquatic species that I think benefit from a lot of just simple design features that can do a lot of good. But again, this kind of goes back to the point of the cost benefit analysis, and we really need to be able to justify kind of investing in these types of decisions. So I think all of that's going to come together and really support being able to make make wildlife enhancements work in the correct area. So next slide. So just a few more pictures of some wildlife enhancements. So we got open bottom culvert on the left-hand side, so a 3-sided box culvert and small bridge, and then a arched pipe, a culvert that basically, again, if you can create that bridge or that bank habitat that kind of provides relief or cover for species that are trying to get through the culvert during high flows, but there's kind of upland area to access and paths. I think that's a big benefit to a lot of different species. And yeah, just the in-stream habitat or the through culvert habitat is really does a lot of good for habitat values. Next slide. All right, and just a couple slides on the federal transportation bill. So Courtney mentioned the bipartisan infrastructure law. And it's really neat because there's a lot of new funding available in the transportation bill, the reauthorization bill. So the first one is the Culvert Aquatic Organism Passage Program. So this is a program that focuses on culvert removal and replacement and anadromous fish passage. So the program provides funding for projects that remediate or connect up to 200 meters of upstream habitat for anadromous fish through culvert or weir replacement. So that's a brand new program. It's a 5-year program under the federal law. So this was, I think, FY 22-23, and it goes through 26. So VDOT was able to submit a grant application under this program, which is really exciting news. So I think the fact that it's a 5-year program, and I hope we can keep submitting applications and keep coordinating and get the correct projects submitted and maybe some funding for some of these projects. But the fact that the federal bill includes these new grant programs is really exciting, I think. And then the Wildlife Crossings Pilot Program is another program under the infrastructure bill. This notice of funding opportunity just came out, I think, about a month ago. But yeah, fingers crossed. I don't want to jinx anything, but I do think VDOT and with the agencies, actually, that's kind of a multi-agency effort. I think we're going to submit an application under the Wildlife Crossing Pilot Program because it's really in line with the WCAP perfectly. As you know, they're looking to advance projects that reduce wildlife vehicle collisions and promote habitat connectivity for terrestrial and aquatic species. So that's really exciting news that program's out, and again, a 5-year program. So more opportunities, I think, in the future. So that's it for me as far as the formal presentation, Courtney.
Thank you so much, Amy. That was fantastic. I was very excited to hear a lot. There's some good questions in the Q&A that I will go through right now. That's really exciting. I do want to say, while we're still on the topic of funding, that there is an organization, a really great one named ARC Solutions, and they create this really cool chart that has all of the funding opportunities you could think of for wildlife crossings. And I will send that out with our follow-up links afterwards, a link to their website, so that anyone who's interested in the audience in any of these funding opportunities, they can look at what's available and what they could qualify for and stuff. So I will include that too while we're still on the topic of funding stuff. But with that being said, I will start with these Q&As. Oh, that's funny. I just see a little question from Renee Callahan at ARC Solutions. I'll start with this one. She says, wonderful presentation, Amy and all. I'm curious to whether VDOT has a process in place for identifying wildlife considerations and funding needs early during transportation planning and projects.
I would say officially no at the moment, but we're working on it. I think that's kind of the nature of my position as a steward, land stewardship, is that's one goal that I want to work on here. So kind of pulling together the the divisions at VDOT, you know, construction and maintenance and structure and bridge and traffic engineering, and kind of pulling together the people that need to be in the room and kind of come up with a process for this need. So yeah, that's part of my role, I think, in my position now, is to do that. And especially with the corridor plan in place now, it's on the list.
Okay, great. Sorry if it gets loud. They decided to mow my lawn at 7 o'clock at night. There's also a question. Oh, this is a great question. So this one is asking, does VDOT have any language that should be inserted into a county's comprehensive plan to highlight wildlife corridors in the future? This is really important for counties that will complete new comprehensive plans in the coming months. For example, Nelson County. There's a couple of thumbs up on that one. So I'm curious if you have any ideas around that, because I have some thoughts too.
Yeah, we don't have any kind of language that I can think of, but I think the fact that this plan is out now, I think, you know, from a NEPA perspective, or just even during the environmental review phase, I think there's parts of the wildlife corridor action plan that you can pull in that would kind of trigger looking at the effects of a project on wildlife connectivity and transportation in general. So I think I would just use go to the wildlife corridor action plan and kind of use that as the planning study that would require some analysis. But to answer your question, no, I am not aware of VDOT in general having specific language at the moment.
So I have two things to say off of that. That is good to know, because I do know that there are other counties such as Loudoun County who have included language already. So as long as Loudoun County was amenable to that, I would be happy to share any county who is interested in language like that. I would be happy to connect different counties together to try to get that language shared, if that's an interest of people, which it seems like it is from that question. So I can definitely follow up with the person about that. And then also, you were starting to get at another question that was asking, is there a website where you can look at finer scale presentation of these maps? So did you want to talk about the Natural Heritage Explorer a little bit? Because I don't know if everybody knows what that is and how they can look at these maps at a finer scale.
Yeah. So anyone can go to nhde.org and view the map. So NHDE has a lot of different layers in it, and you don't need it. You can set up an account, but you don't need to. You can actually just go in and view the map itself and all of the layers that are available publicly through DCR Natural Heritage. So yeah, there's a lot of different layers for conservation sites. Stream conservation units are a lot of what kind of get triggered during environmental review for projects. So the corridor plan has the layers underneath a separate heading on nhde.org. Courtney, I wanted to add something that you said. So I wanted to mention Albemarle County too. That's one county that has a lot of habitat connectivity planning elements in their regional general planning process. So Albemarle County is a really good example too. I'm really impressed of how much that county has forward thinking and planning in their regional land use process. So I think it's called a Biodiversity Action Plan. So they actually have habitat connectivity and conservation elements that are built right into their local planning process in Albemarle.
Yeah, that's a great point too. I have worked with Albemarle County, and they're wonderful biologists. They're working on connectivity there too. So thank you for pointing that out. That's a good point. Somebody also pointed out 2 recent projects in Albemarle County documenting roadkill and tracking bobcat movement. So these are all, yes, there's all kinds of connectivity work in Albemarle County. It's hard for me to say that. So that's good to point that out. I'm going to switch topics a little bit in the questions, because this is a point that I really like to point out too, and that I know I've heard you talk about before, but there's a question that asks, when VDOT builds or replaces a bridge, or wait, that's not the one I was looking for, but we can answer that one too. The one I was, okay. Is it required that aquatic life passage be provided for?
Yes, that's a good question. So that's a regulatory requirement through Army Corps permitting, through the various nationwide permits that we get for our project. So basically any project, typically most culverts and bridges require a nationwide permit or some form of a Corps permit. And there's a regulatory requirement that the North District requires that the pipes be countersunk to I think a minimum of 6 inches. So they have to, so that's solely for the purpose of promoting aquatic passage. So there is a requirement that we countersink pipes.
Good info.
Yeah.
So this is one that I also wanted to hit on is, does the plan contemplate data collection systems, data requirements, etc. going forward? So are there any plans for the plan moving forward, plans for the plan in terms of, I know there's a lot of problems with what data we have and what we can and can't use. So what are your thoughts about that?
Is the question typed up? Can I take, I'm not sure I understood the question.
I can send it to you in the chat. It's basically asking, does the plan talk about data limits and maybe what it can be done to address those in the future?
Yeah,
I think is how I'm understanding.
Yep. So yeah, there's a pretty extensive section on data limitations of the analysis. So yeah, I think there's limitations in what we had to work with for the wildlife corridor analysis. I think the fact that we used existing data sets, there's a lot of assumptions that go into the data and the analysis that we try to be pretty clear about and lay out in a discrete section. So I think a lot of the recommended actions are really trying to address those data gaps and just be transparent that, yeah, there's assumptions in the data and there's more information that's needed and more analysis, but the plan will be iterative, and we kind of repeated that theme throughout.
Yeah, thank you. I also just saw somebody point out that they'd hit 2 deer before, and they're commenting that they'd wish they'd reported to law enforcement so that the data could have been data points collected. So this shows how important it is just to kind of talk about the limitations of data, just so people are aware how they can contribute to it. So I've also seen some questions of what can I do to be involved? There's different ways you can report data, roadkill data, obviously. Don't be on your phone while you're driving, but there are apps you can upload pictures of roadkill to, so that helps scientists too, of course. I know there was a couple more questions. This is a question I think maybe I can answer, and then if you have thoughts about it, I don't know if you want to speak to it, but there's a question about what funding has the General Assembly and Governor designated for present or future wildlife corridor projects. And I'm going to comment at first that is something that Wild Virginia has been pushing for really heavily the past few years, and we haven't made any headway with any funding for it yet. This past session, we tried to get $5 million for one project specifically in Southwest Virginia with the elk. That nothing really happened with the budget this time. So it wasn't that they said no to us. They just kind of said, we're not touching the budget, it seems like. So that's that this year. Last year, there was a bill introduced to give funding for the Wildlife Corridor Action Plan for wildlife crossing projects. That also did not pass. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Amy. We're not going to give up. We're going to keep trying.
No, that was a good overview. I don't have much to add. I'm not aware of any General Assembly separate pots of money out there, but
yeah. There is a question that asks what entities can apply for pilot program money, NGOs, etc. That can all be answered in the ARC Solutions really cool snapshot guide that I will send out afterwards to everybody. Because I don't really know off the top of my head. Do you know, Amy?
I don't, but yeah, not metropolitan planning organizations and state DOTs are, and there's a couple other entities that are listed. But if you go to the notice of funding opportunity, there's a pretty clear section on who's eligible to apply.
Yeah. Let's see. Okay, here's one that says the primary purpose of the plan seems to be avoid car collisions with deer and bear. Were state species of concern considered in the plan, including turtles and amphibians? And what about common species such as foxes? Yeah, you did hit on that a little, but maybe you want to talk about, just remind people why deer and bear were the focus of this one.
Yep. Yeah. So the target wildlife species, you're correct, were deer and bear were the only two specific species that were target wildlife species. So that we did with the wildlife corridor modeling, the resilience corridors, T&E streams. So DWR's T&E streams that have state T&E species associated with them were factored into that analysis. So we did look at some T&E data. I think we looked at critical habitat units. So there is a listed species component. It's not overwhelmingly overshadowing the data, but it was factored in. But you're right. Yep. I think one of the goals in this next iteration is to take just pick some more target wildlife species that the DWR and DCR want to focus on to kind of refine the wildlife corridors. So that's something that we're already talking about doing.
Great. I'm very excited about all this. Oh, this is very exciting. I see two more questions that are kind of the same thing, and then I think we're gonna try to wrap it up. But do you have any specific apps or ways of reporting roadkill that you would recommend? Or who would be appropriate to report roadkill to, that kind of stuff?
Oh no. God, so roadkill for VDOT, it gets reported to the residency. I'll have to get back to, get back to the group on that. But yeah, I think if you just go to the outside VDOT website, there's information on how to report roadkill information to VDOT, especially if you have a carcass that needs to get picked up. I think that a lot of our task orders come into our maintenance folks that way, through phone calls. But I don't know if there's an app for it or not.
I will plug iNaturalist, I think is a great app to use. I know there's a project that somebody I know has created about Virginia's reptiles and amphibians on roads. And if you see them on roads, you can upload them. So there are projects like that where you can upload pictures that can be identified, like on iNaturalist. That's the biggest one I'm aware of, if you can take pictures safely. But in terms of like if you hit a deer, I mean, only time I've hit a deer, it totaled my car, so I had to call the police. But so it got reported, and it was a lot of damage. So those kinds of ones get covered. But okay, I did see one more plug I wanted to make now that we're wrapping this up. But Amy is a member, and I also co-lead the Virginia Safe Wildlife Corridors Collaborative, and I didn't even mention them one time, but they are a really great interdisciplinary group of people throughout the state. It's agencies, academics, nonprofits trying to work together, hopefully in the future, to implement these things that the Wildlife Corridor Action Plan is now highlighting. So did want to point that out for the future as well. There's great groups working on this. If you want to get involved, feel free to reach out to us. I will share contact information afterwards in a follow-up email. We're going to record this webinar because I know I can talk pretty fast. Amy did a great job. You didn't talk too fast, but in case you want to watch again, we'll upload it on YouTube and I'll share it with you. But thank you so much, Amy, for joining us. This was fantastic. And I really appreciate you being here with us. And if any of you are not, and you would like to be, and you would like to support these efforts, of course, I'm going to plug, you can become a member of Wild Virginia. We would love to have you join us and join our efforts to really support this wildlife corridor action plan and everything it is and everything it can be. So thank you all for joining us. Yeah, you all have a great evening.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everybody.
Amy, again.
Yeah. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.